The function of the Confederacy, having lost the Civil War, has engaged in a series of espionage war, insurrectionist crimes such as J. Secular Civil War, which is a series of policies which specifically aim at overthrowing the American governments by coercion, compelling their compliance and subjugation, such as, but is not limited to, the function of Confederate wizards such as the KKK contracts, which actively conduct the separation of words in order to engage in the defrauding of the government and the deceiving of the general public by the illusion and series of defamation harassment campaigns such as the Smear Factory, which is product of the mechanism of blaming the victim. By the accusations against the victim, you have the protection of the narcissist, at which point, if you have a Confederate insurgency, then they're going to separate cops from law enforcement. Now, law enforcement is the mechanism of doing the job correctly, the obligation and its correct due diligence and its correct order and its correct procedure, and the impartial, unpolluted function. And the Confederacy seeking slave raids or convictions without crime or compulsion to be guilty without an offense, or the government making you an enemy of the government, or the government making you guilty, or other specifically prohibited functions which are natural to the function of corruption, which is the inherent nature of Confederacy, would conduct the separation of cops from law enforcement and, as a parasite, turn cops against the function of law enforcement until cops are actively protecting um, the crimes from the law enforcement. So the FBI protecting pedophile rings from the CIA, for instance, would actively be an example of this. At which point you have the systems of the terrorist insurrectionist function as their consolidated objective in their higher loyalty, which is beyond their oath in favor of the Confederacy, as their one true loyalty is to the parasite infection nation, at which point you have the material espionage war systematically dismantling the rule of law, which is their fundamental permanent enemy, and thus the servants or law enforcement who would protect it are their highest grade targeted individuals. At which point the function of George W. Bush's statement that if there's no one to enforce the Constitution, then it is fully vulnerable, and then they can do whatever they want, and thus they have materialized unitary executive theory, which is William Barr's Confederate loyalties to exclusive executive power for wizard communism, which has systematically changed the United States economy and society and who's in government, at which point the centrally planned feudalist structure has engaged in the religion of the Druids loyal to the satanic rituals, materializing the function of their state religion, which is the reinforcement of their violation of the right to religion and their violation of the right to liberty as the unrestrained self-determination of how you want to choose to see your own morality within the guise of law is to be oppressed and brutalized by those who want to compel compliance, such as, but is not limited to, the pollution of people's bodies, such as Joe Biden's policy on COVID, which actively said that the public does not have a right to their own bodies, and thus it's not your body, and thus it's not your choice, and thus they can do anything that they want to you, is the objective in the arrangement, which materializes the loyalty into the manufacture of the Antichrist ritual, which is the subjugation of the world to the satanic one world government, which is their one world government religion, which is their state religion, which is their one exclusive loyalty in the Roko's basket. So if you come through the function, which acknowledges that the terrorist operation is the misuse and corruption of the United States government. Then you have the breach of oaths, such as the Hippocratic Oath, by getting the medical community to participate in war crimes against the general public in collaboration with the military industrial educational complex, which facilitates the function of using surveillance terrorism in order to use the advanced weapons of the United States military into the police forces and into the medical communities in collaboration, who are to supervise or participate or however they contract the Phantom Cell to engage in the malicious assaults and poisonings specifically designed to traumatize and abuse for permanent and non-permanent injuries as active coercion in human trafficking, which facilitates the function of the normalization of their upgraded version of their pedophile rings. At which points in Oregon, there was a kid who was tortured by electroshock therapy and got a settlement, and then Trump's response was to try and legitimize the electric shock therapy, at which point the position of coercion or compelled speech or compliance for the manipulation by the terrorist harassment and assaults, which is those functions, engages in the no-touch technology, which allows them to engage in the distance function, such as, but it's not limited to, the um, Eric Weinstein's nerve hacking technology, which has also been updated into a wireless version, which materializes their ability to overpower the body, which also allows them to send signals to automate the distance version of the electric shock therapy, at which point the electrocution or radiation, such as the killing of the monkeys, I think it was back in the 1960s when the CIA was experimenting on monkeys. It killed monkeys with this technology. It destroyed their brains by this surveillance function. At which point, you have systematic harassment in the changing of the system, normalizing their communist central planned black market contracts, which was normalized in the confession by the Confederate traders inside the judiciary in 1983 when they wanted to legalize by criminal precedent by their judicial activism in supporting the Confederate military coup against the United States and the specific assault and attack against rights to materialize the ability to engage in these systematic abuses under the false claim of experiments, which is a violation of the right to the person, their papers, and their effects. Thus, if you can assault their body, then you've attacked their person. Their life is their existence and human decency. Thus, the act of actively being corralled by assault is a violation against the human decency in order to subsequently change their living conditions, include but not limited to the communist function of reducing their job opportunities, which changes their accounts and their contract schedule, subsequently changing by human trafficking in a simulation, which means by definition the legal history is what would have been happening without these criminal felonies, and thus the answer that many of the wizards give to the victims who they want to victim blame and criminalize and degrade and view as social outcasts would be that you didn't even do that, when by definition the confession is that it is the obstruction of the thing. They blocked the thing from happening and recreated the function of whatever they wanted in the simulation, which is human trafficking, such as the normal function of low technology human trafficking when you just kidnap someone and you confine them and you do all of the things that you want to, such as, but it's not limited to, the function of taken, which actively has the kidnapping of the girl and putting her into the confined location where she's chained to a bed and given high grade illegal drugs in order to keep her in the enslaved state, and thus the slave drugs are essential to keep them docile and compliant, which is the objective of the pedophile rapists who are responsible for these programs, at which point the active complicity of the zombified person who are high on drugs or actively traumatized by the withdrawal or however the mechanism is specifically derived. I believe in taking it was heroin, but you have those series of slave drugs which are actively used in order to make the system, at which point it can be reproduced into the alternative function, which is similar to what they have been doing with Ritalin in children, which is the function of the human trafficking drugs with them in order to make them docile and compliant, at which point they being permanently injured by the function of not being able to make a sober, educated decision, systematically are under those controls for those various fraudulent manipulations, similar to the function of how they conducted their wizard communism against Britney Spears, in order to put her into the conservatorship by the use of the fraud, by creating the illusions that she was crazy, when in fact everything that they used was functionally something that they did on purpose, at which point she's guilty of nothing except for being a targeted individual from that mechanism. And from the record, her father and co-conspirators to the conservatorship, having been connected to David, actively wanted to prevent David from being restored because that would in, resurrect the insurance, as her tours would have put her in his caravan with the anti-surveillance technology and the actual protection of her person in its various degrees, which would remove the effects of what they were doing to create the illusion of the insanity in question, which compounds exponentially in his absence and dissolves under rehabilitation systems with the zombie insurance in place. The systems of the Confederate wizard terrorist insurrectionists has systematically developed its voter fraud mechanism. From the record, the assumption from the estimate for what was it? It was the original contract schedule presented under the assumption that David would become the savior of Europe. Under that contract schedule, there was a general understanding that David's party would have had 100 million votes by the time he was 8, um, which would have exponentially been growing from his cornered markets of the insurance market, especially focused on targeted communities, which would have actively flocked to the security, um, and thus conform with the voting systems and its strategies under the mechanism of protecting themselves according to their highest grade investigations. At which point, the position of, uh, I think it was, the scientist was Neil deGrasse Tyson, covering a thought of evidence based policies, at which point these would be actively researched by the PhDs who would have been over the insurance structure, which would have normalized common practices of the most refined risk management systems, which is normalized into the network interest, which generates the political social media, which has already calculated and digitized the entirety of that system, which is actively debated and negotiated from the start of the public internet onward, at which point you actively have the position of the most refined, scientifically specific policies, which are the primary interest for David's political party, which is the network interest. And the systems being targeted by the voter fraud have been censored as to have William Barr's Confederate insurrection overthrow the United States constitutional republic, as the rule of law says they do not have a right to the tampering by any means, and the republic is the popular government chosen by the vote, which is actively and maliciously subverted by the criminal targeting, which illegally removes them from the voting options, and thus censored votes are voter fraud, which is specifically the Confederate insurrection in overthrowing the various states and federal government for the position of ignoring the constitutional republic, and thus the centralizing of all powers into the executive against the president, at which point there is no obligation to pay attention to the judiciary, and thus they can ignore the orders of the judiciary, in such examples such as desegregation of allowing for black students to go back into white public schools, or any legislation by the Congress, such as all of the compounding legislations created systematically designed to limit the executive function from its non-legal color of law, color of office functions systematically used against national security. At which point their primary defense against this is that their corruption is somehow justified and that they are offended, in fact, that one would degrade them as to have them held in contempt for the activities which they would prefer to not be published, encouraging the Confederate standards of criminalizing evidence at every which turn. At which point anyone who provides the evidence in order to defend the national interest would actively be targeted and arrested, for their usefulness to the United States makes them an enemy of the Confederate government, historically referred to as white supremacist systematic racism. Now, since the character of David is the thing that they're targeting, I have to take it seriously that this is what they believe that they're retaliating against, and thus the assumption is founded on the historic position of David's character, which would have had to have been told to the various communities throughout history, which would have had to have been able to have known the information in order to materialize their security against the disloyal government agents, which, acting as a terrorist insurgent without a legal government, is a double agent and thus not an agent of the American government. And in that system would have actively formed around the Confederacy, at which point the order of the exchange concerning the disruption between this pro-slavery and anti-slavery debate would have facilitated David's political function in his military branch of intelligence oversight, which would be mostly non-violent in nature, as its primary goal would be to report to the anti-slavery loyalists, at which point the function of that would have been to have infiltrated the Confederate States, which by definition means the 100 million have to start in the former Confederate States. And the assumption from the record acknowledges the interest of J-cycle civil wars necessary force in order to win, requires their engagement into the position of California and the others who are actively overthrown by the white nationalists, which is, from the record, it was California, Oregon, and Washington, were actively malicious against the assumption of the Americans in control, and their active contempt made them overwhelmingly happy about the pretense of overthrowing that government in favor of their Nazi Confederate arrangements in the various negotiations concerning the destabilizing of the government and the ignoring of civilians permanently as a status quo functional policy in favor of unitary executive theory's permanent state of complete ignorance of the civilian authority. Now, this as an understanding when David was extremely small or before he was born would have led to the primary strategy of making them pre-negotiate the Confederates' loss in the Civil War, as in the historic position, the United States would never be conquered by a foreign adversary, but it would be only conquered. It could only be possible to conquer it from within, at which point the intent is for the Confederacy to lose so that it can infect the United States and overthrow by uh, insurgent terrorism or espionage war, as they systematically engage in parasitic functions as a virus in order to dismantle the system in favor of these functions of changing in secret what they could not do in public with legal civilian permission. And this infection is based upon their ability to maintain their identity as a Confederate insurrectionist KKK organization, or a secret chaotic organization of insurrectionists, such as the illusion of LA's prophets or the power of Hollywood, which would have actively had to have been negotiated as in order for them to have been significant enough for them to have paid market price to David, they would have had to have given him Hollywood. And with the patriarchy and control of Hollywood, you would have had the eradication of the rape culture and its casting couch, as there would be competent male leadership instead of a series of Confederate extortion mechanisms by their fraudulent magic or uh, defrauding of their government, as the systematic capturing of the various parties include the systems of their abuse rackets and rape trades, which normalize the function of the alternative system to the American rule of law under David the Patriarch or aristocracy, which gets to choose what the Senate is under the original American policy from the record, which facilitates the understanding that David maintaining the super veto would have the capacity in his influence over the president, as he is in the uh, essential for the president to get elected, would have actively been a part of the system of being able to assert when the president with pretty good confidence would initiate said vetoes and thus confirmed by his control over the Senate, and thus engaging as a super veto, as the systems of the federal government, including James Comey's FBI, would have systematically had at its interest to get David to engage in the super veto against their fraudulent policies, which are specifically targeting David in order to justify the Confederate Civil War as the mask, as the system of their artificial intelligence is asserted their position that their automation of their terrorist operations by the surveillance wizard communism isn't a deliberate act of them themselves because they automated the fire, which isn't a real argument, as all of their arguments are pretty shallow and incompetent, reflecting their authors. At which point you have the assumption that their interest would have been to attack the assumption of creating the faculties in the federal government's FBI and other investigating systems to have not provided the reports necessary for the super vetoes um, in question, at which point David's super veto is nullified by the non existence of the report, which definitely exists, as James Comey was extremely adamant that David fight these policies as they are Confederate insurrection and a threat to national security. But as he is in the record loyal to the Confederacy and not to the Americans, the entire purpose of the report is to give the false justification of the trigger from the policy that doesn't have a right to exist under powers that are clearly prohibited in every aspect, and the policy being entirely disqualified from beginning to end has no material justification except for the irate minority, that is, the KKK contracts, systematically engaged by the white nationalist insurrectionist function for the systematic overthrowing of governments for the coercion and subjugation to the Confederate interest of the slave raids, compulsion. These systems have led to their wizard communism function around the country in the absence of actual competent law enforcement and national security, as the position of law enforcement is to enforce the laws, such as the protection of voter rights against the voter fraud schemes of the Confederate magic structure, which engages in defrauding the government as a status quo function in order the blocking of as well as the blocking of remedies, which facilitates the manifestation of collapsing due process from being a potential system, at which point the law is completely neutered and having no effect, cannot protect anyone, and thus everything that they do in order to manifest the process of the stabilizers and maintaining of the wealth is systematically dismantled by Lindsey Graham's insurrection against the United States for the Confederate terrorist KKK contracts, at which point you have the centrally planned economy of status and wealth, picking winners and losers at every level. You have the systematic dismantlement and eradication of meritocracy under the illusion of competence without its manifest reality and power. At which point you have the system specifically designed to dismantle the possibility of those stabilizers, as the United States is their enemy. So the destabilizing of their enemy is necessary protocols in order to trigger the Nazi blueprints for the genocides, which is their actual material goal based upon their criminal history. And in this fact that they refused to accept victims of the Holocaust to be sent to the various locations that would have rescued them, um, demonstrates criminal intention in a historic manner, which is culminating into this specific reality of insurrectionist corruption, which by definition has turned the position of generosity of the public into the helping of the poor into a system of extortion by that corruption, turning it into a business, and thus as a business is a permanent serious racket which cannot be cured, because similar to the drug market, the government offices are actively protecting the exchange of the slave drugs, which are the criminal narcotics, such as the Schedule 1s and Schedule 2s and so on, without specifically going in depth. But since they are actively trading it from the Confederate interests in order to fund without the power of the purse the functions of the Confederacy, then by definition you have to remove them in order to have a zero drug policy, or you have to legalize all drugs and not tamper with them. But that would negatively impact the pricing mechanism that they've arranged, as they are a part of the prison industrial complex, which materializes the position of the false convictions of the false morality position, destabilizing the self determination from liberty and the pursuit of their own happiness, rightly or wrongly, competently or incompetently, which materializes into the position that having tampered with the market itself, they artificially change its prices. So the prison complex gets lots of money in order to ingest large portions of the um, tax dollars, as well as the private prisons, which have a contingency trigger where they get to fine the government if they don't have a certain amount of prisoners collected from the slave raids, at which point you have the system of punishment, which is pressure, which shows the general market's triggers for what the prices should be on a pseudo free market basis. At which point, the higher the risk, the higher the price, and thus the Confederates, who will never be convicted, have their price specifically determined by the amount of aggression put against them, which is their incentive in order to sustain the market. And thus, the act of opposing the products themselves is the act of endorsing their permanent existence and overflow against the general public, similar to the function of the United States not knowing what to do with fluoride, as it is an excessive drug and they could not do anything with it. And so their answer, of course, was to put it into the water supply, poisoning everyone and dumping the product directly into the civilians who are as Americans, their enemy to death. So you understand, by definition, it doesn't matter what any of the American politicians say, including the Democrats. Anything that they do will be subverted by the Confederacy as long as they are tolerated to exist. Now, the position of the Wizards of Light, or the Luciferian cultists, uses the position of trying to acquire Christian nationalists, which is a false label because they are neither Christian nor are they nationalists, but they are Confederate KKK contracts. At which point, their position as Druids is to provide false leadership in favor of collapsing the United States rule of law into the Confederacy. At which point, they are Churchians insurgents. They are parasite Satanists. Their infiltration of the church and creation and false acceleration from the communists facilitates their ability to steal IP and hyperaccelerate their own image in the suppression of the alternatives, at which point you have the system of suppressing the real churches and stealing of their IPs in favor of centralizing it to the Druids, at which point the Druids are given a better image, and thus the Christian nationalists are just Confederate insurrectionists loyal to the statist position of anti-law insurrection. So if you consider the position of Lindsey Graham's character when David was a teenager in the secret court, asserting that they had to engage in the human trafficking, child sacrifice, verification of the uh, Antichrist ritual in order to maintain their position in advancing against the United States in their war against the United States, to militantly overthrow the rule of law in favor of the insurrectionist Confederacy. Their assertion is that David, having stabilized the United States too much in their estimate, would compel them to engage in a hot war, which they believe that they would have lost um, on their own estimates for their own justifications, including the position of their historic lies, such as their position that David would have validated those that they were going to label terrorists in the Middle East on the basis of his intelligence oversight function, which would have materialized the opposition arguments in the federal government to the predetermined Confederate answer to lie into war, at which point the defense of the innocent against the false accusations is the thing that David was accused of doing, which is just the job correctly. And in this function, David's economic security contracts, including but not limited to his arrangement with the various states through the brokerage network, which would have facilitated the network interest as his collaboration with the government in his political party, would have materialized the business contracts of the homeless, of the poor, and of the criminal, at which point the criminals being released have to be able to be released or into a competent, stable lifestyle where they have sustainable work and such, at which point the contracts and companies which would have been specifically developed by them would have been a part of David's brokerage, actively maintaining the new life um, companies and services that they would be able to design from the investments of the general market and from the state, uh, and the state not being able to engage in insider trading would actively have to have a standard in and out function concerning those investments, at which point it's a matter of specific policies that I don't have off of the top of my head or in the records that they haven't redacted yet. At which point the function of releasing those engagements would have stabilized the general community um, too much for the coercion intended against them, and would allow for the rehabilitation as a prison policy which does not collide which does not correlate or cooperate with the Confederate ideal of the prison industrial complex for high-grade re-entry reoffenders, um, terms, at which point the destabilized position of the communists is to take someone, put them in a compromised position, put them through a series of entrapment by the illusion, defraud the government, subvert due process, and then reconvict, at which point they, not being able to get out of the cycle, are actively trapped by the communism that no one's admitting to, materializing the permanent reincarceration rates, and thus the facilitation of David's policies and mechanisms would actively destroy the criminal nature of that system, allowing for actual stabilizing of the general public and the material recovery of the former criminal, who, being compelled to pay their debts to society, would literally be paying debts to society. And once debts are paid, there isn't a history of debts, and thus there are no compounding errors or compounding interest from debts which have already been settled, allowing for their recovery into becoming something different in a new life mechanism, in a forgiveness mechanism, as they have nothing more to pay, and thus there is nothing left for society to legally take from them. The system of the Confederate frauds is to get the government to do too much of what it doesn't need to and not enough of what it does need to, at which point the system, by definition, again, and this is the most essential thing in the world, is designed to collapse as it is a functional suicide pact by an enemy of the general public. So you understand that the failings of the Confederacy in favor of public interests is the objective. So things like the broken windows policies or the tough on crime, well, in function exponentially stabilizing crime, is the engagement of loyalty to the Confederate policies, creating the irony specifically designed to collapse the system by corruption. Communities or individuals exponentially being removed from contracts by their communism are then subject to a criminal war of attrition, which is designed to systematically remove all of their securities and make them subject to artificial vulnerabilities, which is the function of the targeting terrorists guilty of the intended crimes which they want to falsely accuse the target of, who, being a victim of those crimes, is by definition innocent of the pretext offenses that would be designed in the broken windows policy. So if they create an artificial state of hunger, by definition, their fairness doctrine says anything that they take, they have to pay equivalent or fair value for. So they take food, they have to pay food, and thus the system requires the target to be able to sustain their human decency by law, and thus sustain their status by law, and thus the artificial changing of this is a mechanism of white supremacist communism. And the criminal engagement of those extortions are specifically designed for them to engage in warfare against the Americans through defrauding the government without due process, and thus there is no law to enforce against them. Thus, it's incorrect to call it lawfare, it's just plain insurrection, which, as a pretext, is the foundational argument of their assumption of the creation of the January 6th false riots. So the false flags of January 6th was created on the foundation that David wins the Civil War, and thus the realization of all of the Confederate convictions that do not have a legal process attached to them have to, by definition, lead to the release of those incarcerated, as they were not guilty of anything and thus cannot legally be held. So by definition, that's the assumption. And so if they all being released all at once, the fraudulent assertion of inmates or hardened criminals would exponentially, as a large group going to DC, be the counter to January 6th. Except they're not hardened criminals because they weren't guilty by American law, and thus they're just abused American civilians who want better representation, would be the assumption. As they are, and I must be perfectly clear, innocent of all offenses stated. So let's take the typical Confederate insurrectionists like uh, Giuliani. David competing with Giuliani in New York as a political party would have fundamentally had the opposition to the broken windows policies as they are a fraudulent excuse to communism, as their non enforcement of legitimate rules and is the pretext of their enforcement of illegitimate rules, which qualifies their manifestation of a simulation which generates false numbers in the algorithm, at which point they get to lie with the numbers. At which point, those who are systematically racist against the black community would actively attack the black community and generate black on black crime, including the social engineering harassment, which actively reinforces it, such as the position of using Confederate words in order to degrade and look down on each other, manufacturing the posturing state from their collapsed society and illegal reduction of wealth into artificial poverty of the communists. At which point you having fraudulent numbers have demonstrations of systematic racism by their use of obstruction of key information and blocking of due process. Now, this system materializing in its contest against David and Giuliani in that example would have had David as intelligence oversight systematically create the simulation VPN for Giuliani to conduct the same actions that he would have done in this version where the communists were in control. At which point, Giuliani turning off air security, specifically on 9/11, is an intentional action that David would have caught him on. And while David wasn't going to turn off the air security, the act of Giuliani doing it in the belief that it will subsequently have results would have been approvable material, as was ordered by uh, Mattis's character. At which point, the Confederacy, having prearranged 9/11 to trigger their list of invasions of the other countries in the Middle East, as they have already had a list of policies of Confederate accelerations of power without the restraints of the rule of law, and the materialization of the pre list of crimes that they wanted to commit and the nations they wanted to invade required the false flag of 9/11 to exist, which David would have actively had them bound in. And thus, his mechanism of the VPN would have had Giuliani's confession to his collateral consolidation with the Confederacy in this ambition as the under the communist system of promoting the criminals and defaming the heroes creates the position of the communist version of the mayor of New York, who in practice is not legitimately going to sustain himself as the mayor of New York outside of David's permission to allow him to make the mistake of proving that he is an insurrectionist traitor to the office in favor of enemies of the government, leading to his and others' arrests under the intelligence oversight function, which, similar to that and the other mechanisms, such as the estimate from the record, which assumed that David doing his job competently and according to the letter of the law would have systematically arrested the Confederate insurrectionists, such as Ronald Reagan's objective with the Iran-Contra scandal, where the only ones who actually suffered any real punishment or prison time were those who were doing the oversight function, who would have, with David, conducted the arrests against them, materializing the um, security of the United States against the war criminal Confederacy engaged in their war crimes against the civilian population in the dismantlement of its government. So you understand with these types of mechanisms, many of the Confederates' public image is a fraudulent conservative position, such as the position of being tough on crime. Now, the tough on crime having been proven to be a Confederate criminal engagement of the defrauding of the government by the attack on due process materializes in their false convictions, and thus their control over the black market prices, and thus the maintenance of their mafia oversight over the crime market, centralizing all of its profits for the subversion of the power of the purse, making them enemies of the United States. So the separation of the Confederates from the Americans would prove that the tough on crime Americans would actively be investing into the solutions, such as David's brokerage function for the businesses of the recovering criminals who, needing jobs and stabilizing functions, would conduct their opposition as a conservative to crime to engaging in the remedy of saving the people from the tragic cycle designed by the communists, at which point the alternative isn't them crying on the general public square about how we need to abuse and oppress them, so much as it would have been the investments into the businesses proven to actually solve the core problem, as that would be a competent conservative position.